The young man behind the counter barely looked up when the old Marine set the rifle on the glass. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, glanced at the rust, and laughed once through his nose. "Sir, that's not a gun anymore. That's a garden stake with a trigger guard. I can't help you." The old man didn't move. He kept one gnarled hand on the receiver, the other flat on the counter, and his pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the smith's face for a long 3 seconds. "Son," he said quietly, "I didn't ask if you could help me. I asked if you had a piece of 8620 bar stock I could buy." The smith smirked. "Pops, go home. Buy a new one at Cabela's. That thing belongs in a landfill." The old man nodded once, picked up the rifle, and walked out without another word. If you believe an old veteran deserves more than a laugh and a brush-off, type the word respect in the comments right now, because what this 78-year-old Marine did in his own backyard over the next 19 hours is going to leave your jaw on the floor. Earl Whittaker had been tilling the same patch of soft black dirt behind his farmhouse every April for 41 years. The tomatoes always came in late June, and his late wife Helen had loved them so much she used to eat them like apples right there in the garden, salt shaker in one hand, paperback in the other. Helen had been gone 6 years now, and the garden was the one thing Earl still kept up without fail. It was his church, in a way. The rows were straight because a Marine keeps straight rows. The stakes were cut to uniform height because a Marine cuts stakes to uniform height. And every spring he pushed his little Troy-built tiller through the soil and turned it over, and every spring for 41 years nothing had ever come up out of that ground, except earthworms and the occasional rusted horseshoe nail from the 1920s, when the property had still been a working dairy. So when the tiller hit something hard at the south end of the third row on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, Earl assumed it was a rock. He killed the engine, wiped his forehead with the red bandana he kept in his back pocket, and knelt down the way a man in his late 70s kneels, slow, with one hand on the tiller frame for balance. He brushed the dirt back with his fingers and stopped. It was not a rock. What he was looking at was the butt plate of a rifle, steel, hinged. The checkered trapdoor of an M1 Garand buttstock, unmistakable even caked in 4 decades of clay and rust and root hair. His heart did something strange then, a small hard kick behind his sternum that he had not felt since a specific night in 1969 on a hilltop above the Ashau Valley. And his hands began to tremble, though not from fear. He dug the rifle out of the ground with his bare fingers. It took him almost an hour. The wood of the stock was rotted through in 2 places and solid in 3 others, a testament to the walnut that Springfield Armory had used in the 40s. The barrel was a solid tube of orange rust. The operating rod was bent. The trigger group was seized. The gas cylinder was packed with 40 years of compacted topsoil. But the receiver, the heat-treated steel heart of the weapon, the part-stamped US rifle Cal .30 M1, and a serial number that began with a 3. The receiver was still there, still solid, still whole, and as he held it across his lap there in the dirt with the April sun warming the back of his neck, Earl Whittaker began to cry. He did not know why the rifle was in his garden. He would not know for another 6 days. But he knew what it was, he knew what it had been, and he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had spent 26 years of his life as a United States Marine Corps Ordnance Chief, that whatever young fool he took this rifle to next was going to underestimate both the weapon and the man holding it. What none of them knew, not the boy behind the counter, not the customers who would laugh when he walked out, not even Earl himself as he drove home that afternoon, with the rifle wrapped in an old blanket on his passenger seat, was that the forge sitting cold in the back corner of his machine shed had been built by hand in 1951 by a man who had rebarreled rifles on Iwo Jima with nothing but a field anvil and a can of motor oil, and that the steel Earl was about to pull from a scrap bin on the east wall of that shed had been sitting there waiting quietly for exactly this moment for 74 years. He drove the 19 miles into town the next morning. The shop was called Precision Arms and Gunsmithing, a low brick building on Route 9 with a neon open sign in the window and a Punisher skull decal on the glass door. Earl had never been inside before. He had always done his own work, but his eyes were not what they had been in 1982, and a new barrel for a Garand required a lathe with more precision than his old South Bend in the shed could deliver, and so he had swallowed his pride and driven into town with the rifle on the seat beside him and a polite question ready in his mouth. The smith was perhaps 26 years old. He had a neatly trimmed beard, a tattoo sleeve of American traditional roses and skulls, and a black t-shirt that read, "If you can read, This you're in range. His name was stitched on the pocket of the apron he wore over it. Tyler. Earl had walked in slow, the way he walked everywhere now, and set the rifle on the glass counter with both hands the way a man sets down something that matters. Tyler had looked at it for about 1 full second, and then he had laughed. And then he had said the thing about the garden stake, and then the thing about the landfill, and Earl had walked out. He did not slam the door, he did not raise his voice. He did not say any of the 12 different things that were screaming through his head, including a phrase his old gunnery sergeant Horace Biggs had used in Kisan in 1968, that, to this day, Earl had never repeated in mixed company. He simply walked out to his 1994 Chevy pickup, laid the rifle across the bench seat, started the engine, and drove home. But on the way, at the stoplight on the corner of Hampton and Fifth, something shifted in him. It was not anger exactly. Anger was for young men. Earl had buried anger in 1971 with a friend named Danny Escobar in a hole outside Da Nang, and he had never gone back to dig it up. What rose in him at that stoplight was something older and colder and much more useful. It was the thing his father had called quiet work. His father, Howard Whittaker, had been a Navy machinist's mate in World War II, and then a small-town blacksmith for the 46 years after, and Howard had used that phrase his whole life. Quiet work. The work you do alone in your own shop with your own hands, because no one else is going to do it right and no one else needs to know you did it at all. By the time Earl turned into his gravel driveway, he had a plan, and buried in the toolbox under his workbench, wrapped in oilcloth, was a document most men would have framed and hung on the wall. But Earl had never framed it, never shown it, never even told his wife the full story of how he had come to earn it, because some things a man keeps quiet for reasons only he understands. His shed was 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, built from rough sawn oak his father and 3 neighbours had raised in a single Saturday in 1952. The roof was tin and the floor was poured concrete with a drain in the centre. Along the north wall ran a workbench 40 feet long, and above it hung every tool a man could need to build or repair nearly anything made of metal, wood or leather. In the back corner, covered by a canvas tarp that had not been moved in 14 years, sat the forge. It was a squat, ugly, beautiful thing. A firepot of half-inch plate steel welded into a table frame Howard had cut from the chassis of a junked 1948 Ford tractor, with a hand-cranked blower salvage from a long-closed foundry in Pittsburgh. Howard had built it in 1951 in this very shed, standing on this very floor, and had forged on it every week of his life until the morning he died of a stroke in the feed store in 1994 at the age of 79. Earl pulled the tarp off in a single motion. Dust rose in the slanted April light and hung there like incense. The firepot was cold. The anvil beside it, a 212-pound Peter Wright his grandfather had bought used in 1908, was cold too. But the tools in the rack above the bench were oiled and straight and ready, because Earl oiled them every Sunday the way some men read the paper, and he had done so for 31 years. He laid the Garand on the long bench under the fluorescent shop lights, and began to disassemble it. The trigger group came out with a firm strike of a brass drift. The barreled action lifted free of what was left of the stock. The op rod, bent in a gentle curve, slid out of its track with a low rasp. And there on the bench, in pieces, lay a rifle that Tyler the Smith had pronounced dead, and that Earl Whittaker, Ordnance Chief, United States Marine Corps, retired, was about to bring back to life with nothing but the tools in this shed, and the knowledge that had been poured into him over 53 years by men most of the world had forgotten. 340 miles away, in a white colonial house on a quiet street in Arlington, Virginia, a framed black-and-white photograph hung in the hallway between the kitchen and the study. In the photograph, a much younger Earl Whittaker stood in Desert Utilities beside a workbench covered in disassembled M14 receivers, and next to him, laughing at something Earl had just said, stood a lean young Marine captain named Ellis Randall Vickers. The photograph had been taken in 1983 at the Marine Corps Marksmanship Training Unit in Quantico. 42 years later, Ellis Vickers, now a retired 3-star general and the current civilian director of a small, well-funded national foundation dedicated to preserving the history of Marine Corps ordnance, walked past that photograph every morning on his way to his kitchen. He did not know yet that a young gunsmith in a town he had never heard of had just laughed at the man in the picture, but in 6 days he would know, and when he knew, he would pick up his phone. Back in the shed, Earl worked. He did not hurry. A man who hurries around a forge loses fingers, and a man who hurries around a Garand loses an eye. He cleaned the receiver first, soaking it for 6 hours in a bath of kerosene and ATF, and then brushing every surface with brass and bronze picks under a magnifying lamp his father had bought in 1960. He inspected the bolt lugs with a micrometer and found, to his quiet satisfaction, that they were within spec. The heat treatment on the receiver, done 80 years earlier by some nameless Springfield Armory technician on a swing shift in 1943, had held, still remembered, the barrel he set aside for replacement. The op rod was the problem. A bent op rod on an M1 Garand is not a part you straighten with a hammer. The op rod is a precisely heat-treated component that rides in a machined track along the side of the barrel, and the entire cycling of the rifle depends on it being dimensionally correct to within a few thousandths of an inch. You can buy a new op rod for about $200 from 3 different suppliers in America. Earl could have ordered one. He almost did. He picked up his phone and opened the browser and stared at the page, and then he closed the browser and put the phone down. Because somewhere in the back of his skull, Tyler's laugh was still echoing, and something in Earl Whitaker, the same something that had earned him a quiet handshake from a 4-star general in a hangar at Pendleton in 1987, the same something that had put his signature at the bottom of the technical manual the Marine Corps still used to teach armourers how to rebuild the M14TR, that something wanted to do this the old way, all of it, every part of it, on his father's forge, with his father's tools, in his father's shed, alone. He went to the scrap bin on the east wall. The bin was a wooden crate the size of a footlocker, and in it Howard Whitaker had thrown every decent piece of steel he ever came across for 43 years. Drop-offs from a machine shop in Erie, cut-offs from an old railroad bridge replacement in 1973, a broken leaf spring from a 1961 Studebaker, and on the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in brown butcher paper gone soft with age, 3 bars of 8620 round stock, each 12 inches long, stamped with a foundry mark Earl recognised from the 50s. His father had been saving that steel for a rainy day since before Earl had graduated high school. Earl unwrapped a bar, hefted it in his palm, and spoke out loud for the first time since he had left the gun shop. "Pop," he said to the quiet shed, "looks like the day finally got here." And what the young Smith on Route 9 did not know, what he would not know for another 9 days, was that at the exact moment Earl Whitaker was lighting his father's forge with a handful of pine shavings and a kitchen match, a retired general 3 states away was about to glance at an old photograph and feel, without knowing why, the sudden urge to pick up the phone and call a number he had not dialed in 6 years. The forge took the fire the way it always had. Earl laid in the pine shavings first, then a handful of split cedar kindling his father had cut in 1989, then 3 scoops of blacksmithing coal from a burlap sack he had bought off a Mennonite farrier in 2011. He cranked the blower slowly at first, feeding the flame, and the old blower's leather bellows sighed like a sleeping dog waking up. Blue flame rolled out of the fire pot, then yellow, then the deep orange heart of a coal fire coming up to temperature. The shed filled with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, and Earl Whitaker stood in front of that fire with a 6-pound cross-peen hammer in his right hand, and for the first time since Helen had died he felt something he could only call company. The forge was company. The anvil was company. The bar of 8620 heating in the coals was company. His father was company, though Howard had been dead 31 years, and his father's father was company too, though Earl had never met him. And far across the continent, in a place Earl could not see, a man who had once watched him rebuild a sniper's rifle in 41 minutes under a tarp in a sandstorm outside Beirut was about to start walking toward him without knowing it yet. Earl pulled the steel from the fire at a pale lemon yellow. He laid it on the anvil, and he began. He worked for 19 hours. He stopped twice to drink water, and once to eat a ham sandwich standing up. He did not sleep. By 4 a.m. he had forged a rough op rod blank from the 8620 bar, normalised it 3 times in the coals to relieve stress, and left it to cool slowly in a bed of wood ash while he turned to the barrel question. The barrel he could not forge. A rifle barrel in 2026 requires a gun drill and a deep-hole boring setup no home shop on earth can produce. But Earl had something almost as good. A NOS Criterion barrel in .30-06 still in factory wrap that he had bought in 1998 from a quartermaster friend who had been clearing out a warehouse at Rock Island. It had sat on a shelf in Earl's shed for 28 years. He had always told himself he would use it on a project rifle someday. Today, it turned out, was someday. He chucked the barrel in his south bend and cut the threads fresh. He head-spaced it with a set of Forster gauges his father had given him as a wedding gift in 1968. By 8 a.m. the barrel was on the receiver and torqued to spec. By 10, he had finished machined the forged op rod blank on the lathe and the mill, bringing it to within 0.02 of factory dimensions. And then he did the thing that Tyler the Smith, 26 years old and 9 months out of a 2-year gunsmithing program at a community college in Missouri, did not know how to do at all. He heat-treated the op rod himself. He built a small carburizing box out of a length of 3-inch steel pipe, packed the op rod in a bed of crushed charcoal and bone meal his father had mixed in 1978, and stored in a labelled mason jar, sealed the ends of the pipe with fire clay, and buried the entire assembly in the coal forge for 6 hours at a steady cherry red. He pulled it at dusk, quenched it in a bath of used motor oil he had been saving since March, and then drew the temper in his kitchen oven at 425 degrees for 2 hours while he ate a bowl of chicken soup and watched a silent rerun of Combat from 1965 on a small television in the corner of the shed. By 9:14 p.m. the next evening, 27 hours after he had walked out of Tyler's shop, Earl Whittaker sat on an old wooden chair on his back porch, an M1 Garand across his lap, the stock new-carved from a piece of walnut he had milled himself in 2009, the barrel gleaming, the op rod slick with a light coat of oil. In his shirt pocket sat an 8-round on-block clip loaded with Greek HX P surplus .30-06 he had bought 40 years earlier and stored in a sealed ammo can in the root cellar. He walked out to the tree line at the back of his property, set up an old steel plate against a pile of sandbags he kept there for exactly this purpose, raised the rifle to his shoulder, and fired 8 rounds into a 6-inch circle at 100 yards without the front sight ever leaving the black. The M-block clip ejected on the 8th round with the clean, bright ping that every Garand makes, and that no other rifle on Earth has ever duplicated, and Earl Whittaker lowered the rifle and listened to the sound of that ping dying away into the April dusk. And for a long moment he did not move. He did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply stood there in the tall grass with the rifle in his hands and tears on his face, and somewhere above him a mourning dove called twice and then was silent. And then he turned and walked back to the house. He did not know yet that someone in town had been watching. It was the next morning, a Thursday, that the thing began to move on its own. Earl had driven into town to pick up a sack of chicken feed at Hutton's Feed and Hardware, which sat directly across the street from Precision Arms and Gunsmithing. He parked his pickup, and on the bench seat beside him lay the rifle, wrapped again in the old blanket. He had brought it along because his neighbour Ray Holcomb had asked to see it. Ray had heard the shots the previous evening, and had walked over with a 6-pack of Coors to investigate, and Ray was the only man on Earth besides Earl who currently knew that the rifle existed in its reborn state. Earl had told Ray to meet him at Hutton's at 10. Ray was running late, and while Earl waited he did something he would not fully understand until later. He picked up the blanket-wrapped rifle, tucked it under his arm, and walked across the street to Precision Arms and Gunsmithing, because the devil on his left shoulder had finally, after 50 years of silence on the matter, spoken up. He pushed open the glass door with the Punisher decal. Tyler was behind the counter again, leaning on his elbows, scrolling through his phone. 2 other customers stood at the rifle rack along the far wall. Tyler glanced up, saw Earl, and his face did something complicated. Recognition, mild embarrassment, then a reassembling into the same smirk from 2 days before. "Back for more advice, sir?" Earl didn't answer. He walked to the counter, unwrapped the blanket in one smooth motion, and set the rifle down on the glass. It was by any measure a beautiful rifle. The new walnut stock had a light oil finish. The steel was dark and even. The sights were clean. The bolts cycled like a watch when Earl drew it back and let it close. Tyler looked at the rifle. Then he looked at Earl. Then he looked at the rifle again. His smirk did not fall off. It simply went still, the way the face of a man goes still when his brain is running a calculation it does not know how to finish. "Where did you buy this?" Tyler said. "I didn't," Earl said. "I built it," Tyler laughed. He actually laughed. Out loud, in the shop, in front of the 2 customers at the rifle rack. "Pops, come on, you didn't build this. You bought a refurbished CMP gun or something and you're messing with me." Earl did not reply. He reached into his coat pocket and set down, next to the rifle, a small Ziploc bag containing the bent, filthy original op rod, the rotted wood of the old stock and the rust-lock trigger group. Everything he had not been able to save. "This is what I started with," he said. "Tuesday morning, from my tomato patch." The two customers had stopped talking. Tyler's eyes went from the bag to the rifle and back. "That's impossible." "It's not," Earl said. "It's just unfamiliar." And the older of the two customers at the rifle rack, a man in his late 50s with a neat grey moustache, wearing a Carhartt jacket who had been examining a used Remington 700, set the Remington down very gently on the rack and walked over to the counter. He leaned in. He looked at the receiver. He looked at the op rod. He picked the op rod up, rolled it in his fingers, and held it to the fluorescent light. "Son," he said to Tyler without looking at him, "do you see this grain?" "Grain?" Tyler said. "The grain of the steel. You can see the flow lines from forging. This wasn't cut from bar stock on a CNC. This was hand-forged on an anvil and then finish machined." He set the op rod down. He looked at Earl. "Sir," he said, "may I ask your name?" "Earl Whittaker." The man's face did not change, but his hand went very slowly to the counter and he rested it there, and then he said, "Whittaker, Marine Corps." "Yes." "Ordnance?" "Yes." And the man took half a step back from the counter, the way a man steps back when something in a room has shifted in a way he does not yet fully understand, and he said very quietly, "Oh my God." Tyler looked between the two of them. "What?" The man in the Carhartt did not answer him. He pulled out his phone and walked out of the shop without a word, and through the glass Earl could see him standing on the sidewalk in the April sun, phone pressed to his ear, shaking his head slowly. And inside, Tyler looked at Earl across the counter, and for the first time his smirk began to slip. And 340 miles away, in a white colonial house in Arlington, Virginia, a phone rang in the study of a retired 3-star general, and Ellis Randall Vickers set down the book he was reading, a first-edition Hackworth that Earl had mailed him in 1991, and picked up the phone. He listened for exactly 4 seconds, then he said, "Where?" He listened for 3 more. Then he stood up, walked to his bedroom and began to pack a bag, and he did not tell his wife where he was going because his wife had been married to him for 44 years, and she knew from the way he was moving that there were certain things he would explain on the phone from the road. The man in the Carhartt had come back inside. His name, he said, was Dale Pruitt, and he owned a small custom rifle shop 2 counties over. He had driven up that morning to look at the used Remington. He apologized to Earl for staring. He explained that in 1989, when he had been a 21-year-old private first class at Paris Island, a Marine Ordnance chief with a quiet voice and blue eyes had spent an afternoon teaching a class of recruits how to properly clean an M16 bolt carrier group, and that the chief had said one sentence that Dale Pruitt had carried with him every single day for the 36 years since. The sentence was, "A rifle is a promise from the men who made it to the men who carry it, and every time you clean it, you're keeping that promise on their behalf." Dale Pruitt said he had never forgotten the chief's name. Tyler had gone very pale. "Wait," Tyler said. "Wait, Whittaker? Like E.R. Whittaker? The manual?" Earl looked at him. "The green book, the M14TR rebuild manual. We used it in school. The instructor said whoever wrote it was a legend." Earl did not answer. Dale Pruitt answered for him. "He wrote it, son. He wrote the book the Marine Corps teaches you out of. He ran the armory at Quantico for 11 years. He was the chief ordnance instructor for the entire Marine Corps marksmanship training unit. He rebuilt a sniper rifle under a tarp in a sandstorm in Beirut in 1983 because a Marine on a rooftop needed it working in 45 minutes, and the video of him doing it used to be required viewing at every service school in the country until they lost the tape in a records transfer in 2009. The shop was very quiet. The other customer had stopped breathing near as Earl could tell. Tyler's mouth had opened and then closed. Earl reached out, picked up the op rod in its Ziploc bag and put it back in his pocket. And what no one in that shop knew yet, not Dale, not Tyler, not the silent customer by the rack, not even Earl, though he was beginning to suspect, was that the rifle lying on the counter between them was not just any Garand pulled from any dirt. The serial number stamped on the receiver belonged to a specific weapon issued in February of 1952 to a specific Marine, and that Marine's grandson, 6 days from now, was going to walk into a funeral home in Pittsburgh and be handed a small sealed envelope his grandfather had left behind, with instructions that it not be opened until a rifle with a serial number beginning in 3091 surfaced anywhere in the continental United States. General Vickers's plane landed at a small regional airport on Friday afternoon. He rented a sedan, loaded his bag, and drove the 48 minutes to Earl's farm without using the GPS, because he had been to the farm once before in 2004 for Helen's 60th birthday, and a general does not forget the way to the house of a man like Earl Whittaker. He turned into the gravel drive at 4:22 p.m. Earl was on the porch, in the wooden rocker his father had built in 1963, reading a paperback. He looked up as the sedan came up the drive, and he did not stand and he did not wave, but a small, tight smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, and he set the paperback down on the porch rail. Ellis Vickers got out of the car. He was 74 years old, tall, still straight, his white hair cropped short. He stood beside the sedan for a moment, looking at the man on the porch, and the two of them looked at each other for what felt like a long time without speaking. Then Vickers walked to the porch steps, climbed them, and stopped 2 feet from the rocker. "Chief," he said. "General." "Don't you general me, you stubborn old son of a bitch. I haven't been a general in 9 years, and you know it." Earl's smile got a little bigger. "Sit down, Ellis. The tea is in the kitchen." They sat on the porch for 2 hours and did not talk about the rifle once. They talked about Helen. They talked about Vickers's grandson, who had just been accepted to the Naval Academy. They talked about a sergeant named Benitez, who had died of cancer in 2019. They watched the sun go down over the backfield where Earl had test-fired the Garand 3 nights earlier. Only after it was full dark and Earl had made another pot of tea and the two of them were back in the rockers with steam rising from the mugs, did Vickers finally say, "Show me." Earl took him out to the shed. He turned on the fluorescence. The Garand was on the bench where he had left it, broken down for cleaning, every part laid out on a clean white cloth. Vickers did not touch it. He walked the length of the bench slowly, bent at the waist, his hands clasped behind his back the way a general walks a bench, and he looked at every part. The op rod he looked at the longest. He looked at it for nearly a full minute. Then he straightened up, and he turned to Earl and he said, "Who was the kid?" "Tyler, Precision Arms on Route 9. Does he know yet?" "He's starting to." Vickers nodded slowly. He walked to the forge, which was cold now but still warm in the bricks, and he laid his palm flat on the rim of the firepot the way a man lays his palm on a casket. "Your daddy built this." "In 51. "Chief," Vickers said quietly, "you forged an op rod on your daddy's forge because a 26-year-old called your rifle a garden stake." "Yes, sir." Vickers began to laugh. He laughed the way old men laugh from down deep, and he laughed for a long time, and when he finally stopped he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and said, "Son, I flew 800 miles to watch this end. I would have flown 8,000. And that night, in the upstairs guest bedroom where Helen's quilt still lay folded on the cedar chest, Ellis Vickers lay awake for a long time listening to the spring peepers through the open window, and he thought about a hilltop in 1987 when a young captain had watched an ordnance chief rebuild a seized Browning automatic rifle, with his bare hands in the dark by feel, alone because a flashlight would have drawn fire. And he thought about the sentence the chief had said afterward, which was not the sentence Dale Pruitt remembered but a different one, and which Vickers had kept in a locked drawer in his memory for 39 years. The sentence was, "The world forgets us, sir. That's all right. We don't do it to be remembered." The next morning was Saturday. Earl made biscuits. Vickers made coffee. At 9:17 a.m., a sheriff's deputy's cruiser came up the gravel drive, and Earl's neighbour Ray Holcomb got out of the passenger seat looking apologetic. The deputy, a woman Earl had known since she was 12 years old, touched her hat brim and said, "Mr. Whittaker, there's a situation in town. Tyler Mercer over at Precision Arms asked us to see if you'd come down. He's not in any trouble. He just, well, he asked." Politely. Earl looked at Vickers. Vickers shrugged, sipped his coffee and said, "I'll drive." They took the General's rental sedan. The rifle came along, wrapped in the blanket, laid across the back seat. They pulled up in front of Precision Arms at 10:11 a.m. The parking lot was full. Cars were parked along the shoulder of Route 9 for 200 yards in both directions. Earl and Vickers got out. A small crowd was standing on the sidewalk. 15, 20 people, more arriving. Dale Pruitt was there. So was the silent customer from Thursday. So were 4 men in their 50s and 60s whom Earl did not recognize, all wearing some combination of old utility jackets and Marine Corps ball caps, standing in a loose half circle near the door. The door of the shop opened. Tyler came out. He had not slept. His eyes were red. He was holding something in both hands, held out in front of him the way a man holds a thing he's afraid to drop. It was a large-framed document, the glass catching the morning light. He walked across the sidewalk through the crowd, which parted for him without a word, and he stopped 3 feet in front of Earl. He looked at Earl's face. He looked at the ground. He looked at the frame in his hands. And then, very carefully, he knelt. Not dramatically, not theatrically. He simply went down onto one knee on the concrete of his own parking lot, the way a man kneels at a grave or an altar, and he held the framed document up. "Sir," he said, "I found this on the internet last night at 3 a.m, and I had it printed and framed at the Kinko's in Moberly this morning. I want you to have it, and I want to say, in front of these people, because they deserve to hear it as much as you do, that I was wrong. I was wrong about the rifle. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things, and I don't know how to make it right, except to say it out loud and to ask you if you would consider coming into my shop sometime and showing me how you did it. Please." The document in the frame was a photograph of a page from the Marine Corps Ordnance Technical Manual, Chapter 7, Section 3. At the bottom of the page, in small print, was the authorship credit. E. R. Whitaker, Chief Warrant Officer 4, USMC. And below that, a second document in the same frame, a citation for the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, with Combat 5, awarded to the same man for actions on a hilltop above the Ashau Valley, November 1969, when, under sustained enemy fire and with no illumination, he had repaired the damaged feed mechanism of an M60 machine gun in approximately 4 minutes, thereby enabling the defence of a position on which 23 men subsequently lived to walk off. Earl read the citation. He had not read it in many years. He had never framed it. He had kept it in the oilcloth in the bottom of his toolbox because his father had once told him that a man who hangs his medals on the wall is a man who is still waiting for someone to tell him he did a good job. Earl had never been waiting. He reached down with both hands and took the frame from Tyler. He looked at the young man's face. He saw, in the red eyes and the unshaven jaw and the trembling of the lower lip, the ghost of every young Marine he had ever taught. Every PFC who had arrived at his armoury on a Monday morning not knowing a gas piston from a camshaft, and who had left, eventually, knowing. And Earl Whitaker, 78 years old, retired Chief Warrant Officer, United States Marine Corps, did the thing he had always done when a young man came to him honestly and asked to be taught. He reached down with his free hand, took Tyler by the elbow and lifted him gently to his feet. "Son," he said, "get up. Don't kneel to me. We don't kneel to each other in this country." And he turned to Vickers, who was standing just behind his shoulder, and said, "General, would you get the rifle out of the back seat, please?" Vickers did. Earl took the Garand, unwrapped it, checked the chamber out of habit, and handed it across to Tyler. "Take this inside," he said. "Put it on the bench. I'll be in a minute. We'll start at the beginning." The crowd on the sidewalk did not cheer. It was not that kind of moment. They simply stood there, some of them with their hands over their mouths, some of them with tears on their faces. The 4 old Marines in the ball caps came forward one at a time, and each one of them shook Earl's hand without saying anything, and then stepped back. Dale Pruitt shook his hand too. The silent customer shook his hand. The sheriff's deputy saluted him, though she was a civilian deputy and had never served. Tyler went inside the shop carrying the rifle as if he were carrying an infant, and Earl Whitaker turned to the general and said quietly, "Ellis, I believe I am going to be late for lunch." In the weeks that followed, the story did what stories do in small towns with active social media. A video taken on someone's phone, a shaky 12-second clip of Tyler kneeling on the concrete with the framed citation held up, went onto the internet on Saturday afternoon and had 7 million views by Wednesday. The Marine Corps Times called. So did a producer at CBS. Earl declined both politely. A retired colonel from the Ordnance Preservation Foundation that Vickers directed drove down from Virginia and spent 4 days documenting the Garand restoration in detail, taking photographs and video of the op rod, the forge, the receiver, the process. The Foundation eventually placed the rifle, at Earl's request and with Vickers' signature, on permanent loan to the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, where it sits now in a glass case in the Ordnance Wing, next to a small brass plaque that reads, "Restored by CWO 4E.R. Whitaker, USMC, retired, from scrap on his father's forge, April 2026. And in a quiet ceremony in Pittsburgh 6 weeks after the incident, a 44-year-old man named Gregory Linder opened an envelope at a funeral home, as instructed by his late grandfather's will, and found inside a single sheet of paper. The paper said, This rifle was mine in Korea. Serial 3091477. I lost it in a river crossing in 1953. If it has surfaced, please find it, and please thank whoever brought it home. The grandfather had been a Marine. He had been, in fact, in the same battalion as Earl's father. The rifle, it turned out, had travelled home from Korea in a footlocker belonging to a different Marine entirely, had been sold at a yard sale in Ohio in 1978, had been buried in the yard of a farmhouse in 1984 during a divorce by a man who did not want his ex-wife to find it, and had been forgotten there when the property was sold, and sold again, and finally sold to Earl Whittaker in 1985, who had tilled over that exact spot every April for 41 years without ever striking steel, until the tiller finally, at the right depth and the right angle, and on the right spring morning did. Gregory Linder drove down to the farm in June. He and Earl sat on the porch for an afternoon and did not say very much, and when he left he did not take the rifle with him, because by then the rifle was already at Quantico, and that was where, they both agreed, it belonged. And Tyler Mercer closed his shop on Route 9 for 3 days in May, and drove out to the farm with a notebook and 2 thermoses of coffee, and a humility he had not been born with but had earned, and he sat with Earl in the shed from sun-up to sundown for those 3 days, and Earl taught him the things a man teaches a young man who is asked to be taught. At the end of the 3rd day, Tyler walked out to his truck, and then he turned around and walked back, and he stood in the doorway of the shed with the long April evening light falling across his shoulders, and he said, "Chief, why didn't you ever tell anyone about Vietnam, about the manual, about any of it?" Earl was at the anvil putting away his hammers. He did not turn around. He said, "Because, son, the men I did it with didn't get to tell anyone either, so it didn't feel right for me to." Tyler stood there for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then he left. Earl finished putting away the hammers. He hung the last one on the rack, a 4-pound rounding hammer his father had bought in 1957, and he turned off the fluorescent lights and closed the shed door and walked across the dark grass to the farmhouse where a single lamp was burning in the kitchen window. He made himself a cup of tea. He sat in his chair at the kitchen table, and on the wall above the table, where for 6 years nothing had hung at all, there was now a small frame, no bigger than a paperback book. In the frame was not the citation, and not the manual page, and not any photograph of Earl himself. In the frame was a single Polaroid photograph, taken by Ray Holcomb on that Tuesday in April, of a rust-locked, dirt-caked, broken M1 Garand lying on a workbench under a fluorescent shop light, with a man's hand, a gnarled, age-spotted, steady hand, resting on the receiver. On the bottom of the Polaroid, in Earl's block handwriting, was a single sentence: "Quiet work still gets done." If this story moved you, if you believe that the men and women who serve deserve more than a smirk and a dismissal, more than to be called scrap by people who have not yet learned what they are looking at, then take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they are true and because they're still happening in small towns and small shops all across this country every single day. Share this video with a veteran you love. Leave a comment below and tell us about the quiet hero in your own life. And remember, the next time you see an old man walk into a room with his hat in his hands, do not be the one who laughs. Be the one who stands up. Thank you for watching.